On top, again, the question of the previous quiz. Here are the answers. If you cannot find the answer, just go back to earlier in the video to make sure that you do understand what's going on. Which brings us to chapter 3. So here you have an overview of what we're going to do in the remainder of this lecture, which, as you have figured out, will probably run a bit longer than 2 hours, but we'll see. Chapter 3 of the book. And I will build on the demand and supply model that we saw in the previous chapter. So, we're going to use supply and demand to answer a couple of questions. Okay, what's the background of these questions? Well, we are economists, so ultimately we would like to say something about welfare. I will be much more precise about that in the last lecture, actually, but for now let's deal with that. And more precisely, what we would like to do is we would like to make recommendations to government, if you like, on how to behave in markets. Should a government do something to make sure that markets function better? Shouldn't they? Should they intervene or not? And in order to sort of figure that out, we first have to have a good measure of what we would like, right? If we want to know whether you should intervene, we should know what the effects of the interventions are, and we should have some measure to evaluate those effects. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at now. We want to measure the benefits that accrue to producers and consumers in the market, essentially, and we want to know how government interventions, taxes, for example, how they would affect those markets, and hence how they would affect those benefits. That's the agenda in this chapter. So first of all, we need this measure, right? That measure is going to be something that we call consumer surplus. Okay, here's how that works. Let me move it immediately to the next slide. Suppose that we have a demand function. This is the demand function for apples in this case. And, well, there's a choke price at $5.50 and it slopes down, all nice. And suppose that this is the market price. It's 3.5. Okay, and suppose that this demand curve actually reflects the demand for one apple of individual consumers. So every point on this demand function represents one consumer, essentially, just to make my story a bit easier. Okay, so here, if you move slightly to the right here, so here is one person who is willing to pay $5.50 for an apple, or for a pound of apples, a kilo, whatever. Anyhow, this person is willing to pay $5.50. However, the market price is $3.50, so that person is definitely going to buy her apples. Also, we can wonder, well, how happy will this person actually be after she has bought her apples? The answer being, well, she will be pretty happy, right? How happy? Well, arguably she will be $2 happy, right? In the sense that she was willing to pay $5.50, but she only has to pay $3.50. So at the end of the day, she actually has a benefit of the difference between the two being 2, right? Okay, now consider this consumer here. This consumer A is willing to pay 5, only has to pay $3.50. Her benefit, $1.50. This person willing to pay $4.50, only has to pay $3.50. Benefit, $1. And there are lots of other people in between here where we can do the same exercise as well, right? We can move all the way down. What about this person? Well, this person is sort of, well, is willing to pay 3, but if she would buy the apple, would have to pay $3.50, so that person is simply not going to buy the apples, right? So her surplus will be 0. I already used the word surplus here because that's how we're going to call this difference, the difference between what you are willing to pay and what you actually have to pay. Okay, so let's now look at all the consumers combined. So this consumer here has a surplus of 550, this difference, and this person has this difference, and there's the person here who has this surplus. So what if we look at the total surplus of all consumers combined? Well, then we would end up exactly at this yellow triangle, right? This is simply the sum of the individual surpluses, and that gives you, total consumer surplus. That's our definition of total consumer surplus, and we will use that as a measure of how happy consumers are with what happens on this market. What about producers? Well, we can do the same thing, right? We can look at producer surplus, which is something different than profits, but we'll get back to that later. So suppose that producers have this supply function. So there's a choke price here, and this is supply, and again assume that market demand is 350. Same story as before. Here we have somebody who was willing to sell tomatoes for 150 but actually gets 350. So that person has a surplus of $2. Somebody here is slightly lower. This person has a surplus of 150. This person has a surplus of 1, etc. So the total producer surplus will just be the sum of all these individual surpluses, and that gives you the green rectangle, right? So that will be our measure of how many benefits producer gets. So what will be our measure for total welfare, if you like? That will simply be the sum of producer and consumer surplus. Okay. Having established that, let's look at how price regulations affect this market outcome. Because sometimes what you see in practice is that governments intervene in markets, for example, by setting a price ceiling. They say, well, we do not let prices go higher than this because we have to protect consumers. Sometimes they argue, well, we don't want prices to be lower than a certain level, applies floors, because we want to protect producers, farmers, whatever. It's often in agricultural markets. And we're going to be interested in price ceilings and price floors that are binding, right? If they're non-binding, they simply don't have an effect, so that's not really interesting. So what we are interested in is what are the effects of price ceilings, price floors on markets, and especially on who benefits, who gets what, and what is the total surplus, the total welfare. Okay. We're going to look at total welfare. That will be the sum of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue. I haven't looked at government revenue yet, simply because I didn't have anything so far. What we will also be interested in is something we call deadweight loss. So that's how much total surplus goes down as a result of some market efficiency. So there's a distortion in the market, and we're going to look at how that distortion affects total welfare. And the difference between when there is a distortion and when there is no distortion, that's going to be the deadweight loss. But those concepts are much easier to explain, to understand after I've given a couple of examples, right? We're also going to look at transfers, which is that, well, surplus that moves from producers to consumers or vice versa as a result. So here is the example of a price ceiling. So this picture looks a bit complicated, maybe mainly because it is. So let me talk you through it. It's also in the book, figure 3.7 in the first edition. So what we have here is a demand and a supply curve, right? So without any intervention, the equilibrium is here and at W. So there, the quantity is 10. In this case, 10,000 pizzas per month, and here the equilibrium price is 10. Okay, so it's now suppose that government imposes a price ceiling. For whatever reason, they decided that pizza should not cost more than $8 per month. So what will be the effect? Well, before we do that, let's first look at the original situation. So when we're here and look at consumer surplus in this case. So as you know, consumer surplus is the area below the demand function and above price, because this person has a surplus of 20 minus 10 is 10, this person has that, etc. So in other words, consumer surplus before imposing the price ceiling is A plus B plus C, as you can see here. What about producer surplus? Very similar. The area above supply, below price, so that's D plus E plus F. So that's the situation before the ceiling. Consumer surplus is A plus B plus C. Producer surplus is D plus E plus F. Okay, so what happens after the price ceiling is imposed? Well, this will be the price. So what will happen? Well, demand will be this amount, 12 in this case, but supply is only 6 at a price of 8. Pizza makers are only willing to supply 6,000 pizzas per month. In other words, there's excess demand, and excess demand is 12 minus 6 equals 6,000 pizzas per month. So what will happen on this market? Well, of course, we cannot force pizzerias to make pizzas, so they are the short side of the market, if you like. So this will be the amount that will be traded, right? No more than 6,000 pizzas will be traded. Consumers want more at that price, but well, we cannot force suppliers to deliver that. So this will be the new equilibrium output, and this will be the new price. So what happens to producer surplus? Well, producer surplus again is the area below price and above supply. So only this area F is left. What about consumer surplus? Well, this person has a surplus of 20 minus 8 is 12. This person has a slightly lower surplus, etc., etc., etc. But this person who's willing to pay 14 only has to pay 8 is actually the last person that is still able to buy a pizza. All the other people are willing to pay more than 8, but there's no pizzeria willing to give it to them. So in other words, total consumer surplus after the price ceiling is imposed is A plus B plus D. So what happens at the end of the day? Well, at the end of the day, if you look at the situation before and after, this area is lost, right? C plus E. We had that before the price ceiling, but we don't have it now. So that's our deadweight loss. That's simply how much total welfare goes down because of the intervention, because of the price restriction in this case. What else happens? Well, also this area D used to be part of producer surplus. It's now part of consumer surplus. So this area D is a transfer from producers to consumers. So here's another example of such a price regulation. Well, student associations may argue for a cap on rental rates for student rooms, right? Because otherwise you could argue rooms are no longer affordable to students. So that may sound like a good policy. However, exactly the same reasoning as we saw here. What will happen is that such a policy would lead to a shortage on the housing markets. Students already have a room. They would benefit simply because there's this transfer from producers to consumers. But those who cannot find room because of the shortages would be hurt, and landlords would be hurt as well. That's completely similar to the pizza example that we had there. Okay, back to the elasticities. Of course, your deadweight loss will also be affected by how steep your curves are. So here we have a pretty inelastic curve on the supply side, a pretty inelastic curve on the demand side, which means that the deadweight loss is pretty low. But here, as the curves become flatter, this area is going to be bigger, hence the deadweight loss is going to be bigger. Okay, let's do another one. So this one is very similar to what we had before, but now we have a price floor. So this is about peanuts, and for some reason government decides to support peanut producers by putting a price floor. Very similar to the story before. So without this intervention, this would be the market equilibrium. So consumer surplus would be the area below demand above price, so that would be A plus B plus C. And producer surplus would be the area below price above supply, so that would be D plus E plus F. But now we pose a price floor of 1,000. So supply at that price would be this, but demand is only this amount. Since we cannot force people to eat peanuts, this will be the amount traded on the market. Only the 10 million tons will be traded. So what's the new consumer surplus? That's only this area A. What about producer surplus? Well, everything below price, above the supply curve, but up to the point where trade takes place, right? So that's area B plus D plus F. So what happens at the end of the day? Well, there's a deadweight loss. This area just goes to waste. So that's our deadweight loss, C plus E. And also this area B is going to change, right? It's going to be transferred. It used to be part of consumer surplus, but now it's part of producer surplus. So that's a benefit for producers. And as you can see, this area is, so what producers gain is actually bigger than this area, what they lose. So they are better off. Consumers are worse off, and net effect is also for total welfare to be lower. So what about quantity regulations? Well, with prices, you can put a maximum price, you can put a minimum price. Something very similar is true with quantity regulation. So you could impose a quota. That's often done to limit exports. So what would happen if there is a quota? Okay, so suppose this is supply, this is demand. The original situation, the market equilibrium is here. So consumer surplus is A plus B plus C. Producer surplus is D plus E plus F, as you know by now. But now suppose that a quota is imposed. It cannot be more than 500 units traded per year. What would happen? First of all, what would be the new equilibrium price? Well, if 500 can be traded, then consumers would be willing to pay 100, right? Just plug that 500 into their demand function. However, producers are only willing to supply 40. Plug in the 500 in the supply function. Again, we cannot. That sentence didn't start out right. So what will happen? Well, these consumers will simply bid up the price, right? And they will bid up the price to 100. And these people are more than happy to supply that. So in the new situation, what's the consumer surplus? Area A. What's the producer surplus? Again, the area below price but above the supply function. So that's going to be the area B plus D plus F. So which of the producers will be able to supply this product? That depends very much, right? Many of them are willing to do it at that price, but yeah, it depends on who is lucky or who has the strongest lobby or whatever. What about welfare? This area is lost, C plus E. This part used to be part of consumer surplus, but is now part of producer surplus. And again, I also keep my bookkeeping here, right? So that you can also see, compare those areas and see what happens. So this is another example. So the municipality of Groningen has a rule that restricts the number of houses of which room can be rented to students to 15% in any given street. So essentially, that's a quota. So what happens? with that policy? Well, it will drive up prices. It will not lead to shortages. Everybody who wants to buy can buy, also in this example. But there will be a welfare loss, and there will be a transfer from consumers, students in this case, to producers, the people renting out the rooms. Which brings us to another quiz question. So, simple setup. Suppose demand is given by this equation here, and supply is given by that very simple equation here. Question, what is the deadweight loss if we impose a minimum price of 60? What is consumer surplus and what is producer surplus in that case? I will give you the answer in a sec in the next video.